Though the Great War was ending, the problems were just beginning for the world, both for the realms, Nilfgaard, and non-humans. And at the center of everything, we join three men, all from very different walks of life, who find each other in the quiet night of the forest, surrounding a campfire. Though each of them is skeptical of the other, they eventually find a little comfort in the dark, lonely woods. One referred to himself as Siguruvin, who spent his life in the northern kingdoms. Boreas Munn, who was a Nilfgaardian, who had run-ins with Geralt while working for Stefan Skelling. And the third was an elf, who didn't introduce himself till much later. The three of them, despite their differences in race and nationality, had found each other and were enjoying a meal together, each describing the events that led them to the point that they were currently at, alone in the woods. Boreas Munn started with a discussion regarding a document known as the Peace of Cintra. In the castle of Cintra, where just 5 years prior, Queen Calanthe plummeted to her death and Ciri was taken from the city by Cahir, the leaders of the North were meeting with emissaries of Nilfgaard to sign a treaty. Many of which you'd expect to be present were in attendance, such as King Foltest, King Henselt, King Demavend, as well as Queen Meve. Additionally, Cyrus of Novigrad, Ithane of Sedaris, and Shalard of Nilfgaard were also in attendance. Being that Redania had no king, and Radovid was still far too young, Djikstra was there, representing Redania, which bothered Henselt and Foltest. They were disgusted that a spy was in their midst, but they kept their thoughts to themselves, for now at least. They organized themselves by small groups, chatting with each other about political matters, as well as the future bride of Emperor Emhyr. The meeting also had additional guests, but these guests were not present with those that I had just mentioned. A floor above, the kings and queens of the North, the Lodge of Sorceresses, patiently waited for the meeting to begin. And in the words of Philippa, they will be watching over to make sure the boys don't go wild. The meeting below had erupted into a fury. King Henselt of Kedwin had gotten enraged at Demavend of Edirn at the thought of conceding any of his land to Nilfgaard or to him. Demavend responded that the land that he had wished to be given was Edirn's soil, taken by Kedwin. But Henselt felt entitled to the land, as his army had been liberating it from Nilfgaard, and was no longer occupied by Edirn's people. Around the same time that Meve was forming her militia, Edirn was getting hammered hard by Nilfgaard, and as such, Henselt sent a large portion of his army south to liberate Edirn. But according to Demavend, Henselt's men did no such liberating. They may have had the occasional skirmish with Nilfgaardian soldiers, but they pillaged their towns, raped their women, and stole things that weren't properly theirs. They were monsters, masquerading themselves as liberators and heroes. The floor above, actual progress was happening. Sabrina Glevissig, King Henselt's court sorceress, assured the other ladies that she could convince the king to withdraw his armies from Edirn in just 10 days' time. And with that taken care of, the conversation then got shifted to something much more dire, the fate of Dol Blathanna, an elf province given to the elves from Nilfgaard, and whose ruler was present with the lodge, Francesca Findabair. The sorceresses were far more productive and calm in their negotiations, and Francesca was very much willing to work with King Devimund's wish to reoccupy the land that once belonged to him and his people. The biggest issue, however, that she predicted was that of the scoia'tael commando in her country, which she subtly implied that though they had fought for Nilfgaard, and the people would surely want revenge, she had a solution. Things in this world are typically quite bleak, but at this point, things actually take a turn for the worse, even for the elves, who have already been fighting for land that was taken from them so long ago. The agreement reached would see Nilfgaard hand over 32 scoia'tael commanders to the north to be sentenced and tried as war criminals. The army that they had followed and fought for in an attempt to retake some land was sending them to the north as scapegoats. Issengrim being one of the elven officers. Days of negotiating would take place regarding trade, land, prisoners, and many other things, but one more large issue presented itself, one every ruler had been avoiding until now. What of Cintra? The sorceresses had several ideas regarding the issue, suggestions for giving the land over to Temeria under Foltest's rule, while others suggested using it as an independent city that could act as a central point open to those to the north, as well as the people of Nilfgaard. A suggestion even came up to split the land and divide rule, but soon, Emhyr, a sorceress of Nilfgaard, had said the fate of Cintra had already been decided. They just didn't know it yet. Of the other sorceresses present, it was only Triss who understood what she had meant. We transitioned to the capital city of Nilfgaard, where Emperor Emhyr was speaking with his head of Secret Service, Vatir, before they are approached by two women, one of which was his loyal subject Stella, who had spent her recent days teaching royal etiquette to the second young lady approaching him. Emhyr was holding a very valuable piece on the chessboard for the possession of Cintra, their princess, or at least, so the rest of the world thought. Bearing a remarkable resemblance to Ciri, Emhyr sought to use this doppelganger to marry and have free claim to Cintra's throne. He had even taken a liking to the young girl, as she reminded him so much of his daughter, and not just in appearance. The two of them would travel together to Cintra to finalize the signing of the treaty. Following the signing of the treaty, it marked the beginning of a new era. A celebration spanning several days would occur in Novigrad. Julia Pretty Kitty Abetamarco and her company of free mercenaries were cheered for as they paraded the streets. She would look to a balcony and see Foltest, Demivind, Henselt, and a very young Prince Radovid, who felt a gaze from behind him. The 13-year-old prince felt frustration. His father was murdered, and nobody was cheering his name or his grieving mother's. He turned his head to briefly meet Philippa's gaze. Just you wait, he thought, showing us the exact moment where Radovid the Stern is born. From behind Philippa, Djikstra entered. He informed Philippa that he needed to speak with her privately. Djikstra, unlike everyone else, wasn't interested in the posterity of the celebration, but as we will soon find out, he has his reasons. Jumping around yet again, we now join Ciri's childhood friend and now war veteran, Jar, who was on a wagon with a young woman named Lucien, and they were transporting a group of now disabled veterans, including himself, now with a stump where one of his arms used to be. He was still having trouble coping with the fact, but he appreciated Lucien's company because she treated him like a normal man, which was not at all how he felt, or was being looked at by others. She handed him the reins and noticed a brass trinket he had. Being that his hand was full, she took it from him without him even realizing it. The trinket he was holding was known as a forget-me-not. She read the name in the medallion, Rayla. She then assured him that she would not forget him. The more she tries to pry, the more he resists answering any personal questions from her. They exchange a few words when something catches their eye. Jar had heard that there were no more scoia'tael remaining, but sure enough, 8 riders on 6 horses of elves were rapidly approaching them, but something seemed off. Here, Jar and all the others on the wagon would see a very rare sight. These elves were scared, fleeing, and reeking of blood, sweat, and festering wounds. 5 of the riders simply rode past, but one had matched their cart's speed. Lucien immediately recognized the situation. The female elf and her passenger were experiencing starvation. She knew it well. Both Lucien and several men from the back of the cart held out their arms, bearing bread, cheese, and sausages. The elves were overwhelmed with gratitude. One of them even managed to thank them in their human Nordline language. Still, however, on the run, Teruviel urged her horse on, and they disappeared. None of the men on the cart said a word. Shortly after, a group of riders, being led by a woman with short white hair, approached and asked where the elves had gone. Once again, the cart remained silent. The short white-haired woman suspected that she was being lied to, but she assured everyone that it did not matter, as White Rayla always catches her prey. And they rode away, leaving the cart once again silent as the grave. Back in Novigrad, the parade was still occurring. The dwarves of the volunteer regiment were celebrating, while the North's leaders were looking on them with disgust. Despite their contribution to the North's victory, the leaders digress that they should have cut their wages, or at the very least, they should have been removed from the tellings and the writings of history. And not just the dwarves, but the halflings, gnomes, and witchers as well, as they had no place in human history. Even though the war was over, the petty power struggles were just beginning. Some sought to remove non-humans, others removed Djikstra, and others, mages altogether. Philippa leaned into Djikstra and wanted to know why he required an audience. He quietly told her he had information on the half-elf who assassinated King Vizimir, and he had proof. Suddenly interested, Philippa assured him that they would meet very soon. Issengrim continued his telling of the Nilfgaardian as well as his own queen's betrayal in being handed over to the North as war criminals. He and his brothers were shipped by boat and then lined up and walked out to the town where they would be hanged until dead. They were all shackled together, and nooses were thrown around their necks before they had even reached the gallows. Issengrim's followers, as well as friends, wished him farewell before being completely drowned out by their screams as they were dragged from their nooses to the gallows. But Issengrim was taken to a separate place. He was brought to a small shack in the harbor where a hangman had told him that he would be given a pardon. Issengrim mostly ignored the comments the man was making and continued fidgeting with the shackles around his wrists. There was, however, a condition to his pardon, but like I said, he had no interest in listening. The shackles around his wrist had given way, and he proceeded to beat senseless the 2 guards that were next to him, before leaping out of a window, out of the harbor, and into the sea, being pursued by crossbow bolts diving after him. So we know now why Issengrim and Boreas Mun were in the middle of the woods all alone. But why Djikstra? Djikstra had an assistant who served him for many years, and after the parade, Djikstra sought him out to say goodbye. He had told him that he had said one thing to the wrong person, and now he had to leave. He just never thought that that one person would be Philippa, who he had spent so many years growing attached to and began to trust. And not a moment too soon, for that night, several hired killers would invade his private chambers with murderous intent. But only one man would die that night. But it would be Ori. And it wouldn't even be at the hands of the assassins. Rather just sickness itself. And so Djikstra escapes Novigrad, filled with the bitter taste of betrayal. Now back at the center, the campfire was dying down, and surrounding it were three men, stuck in a strange new world, with only each other. They all agreed to travel together, and officially introduce themselves. Boreas Mun of Nilfgaard, who had once served Stefan Skellen at Vilgefortz's fortress, who abandoned his post and fled due to a combination of guilt as well as fear when Geralt and his friends sieged the castle. Issengrim, the once scoia'tael commando. And finally, the man who was just known as the Pilgrim introduces himself as Siggy Reuven, an alias taken from the now fleeing spy, Djikstra. The three had lost everything they had worked for and everything they had ever known, now only having each other in a very strange new world. So now we're to the end of the video and the end of the story for the most part, but it does leave us with a lot of open storylines. So that brings me to a question where, with a lot of you guys who read the books, how do you take the games? I personally feel like CD Projekt Red did a phenomenal job picking up where the books left off and giving us a satisfying ending, but I also want to know how other members of the community feel. Because I wouldn't say it's a dissatisfying ending to the story, but it does definitely leave a lot to be desired, so let me know what you think. And as always, thanks for watching.